Good morning. Let's return today to Luke chapter 22 as we continue our study there through the Gospel of Luke. Actually, we're going to be studying about what we just did. We studied about the Lord's Supper and what we call the institution of the Lord's Supper. I want to focus particularly on the context of that. I think it sheds a lot of light on the Lord's Supper as we look at the context in which it was originally given. So beginning of verse 7 of Luke 22, it says, "Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, 'Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat it.'" So now, from that, I want to take a huge sidetrack to go back to the original Passover. Let's just remember what's going on here. What is it they're remembering? What was involved in preparing for this? And then see how Jesus sort of transforms it in the giving of the Lord's Supper. So with that in mind, you may want to place a marker there or something and turn back to Exodus, where the original Passover took place. The original Passover was, of course, in the land of Egypt. 12 to 1400 years before Jesus. So for well over 1,000 years, for centuries, the Jews every year had remembered a particular event that took place as the Lord freed his people from Egyptian slavery. Now, you'll recall, of course, that the Egyptians were very cruel taskmasters. As the book of Exodus opens, the people of Israel multiplying, and it frightened the Egyptians, so they decided to be extra cruel to them to hopefully kind of tamp down on their growth. It didn't work. They took away their straw down. They finally declared, toss all their baby boys in the river. That didn't work. But you can just imagine how, well, we can't even imagine. It was, they were crying out to God for deliverance, help. And God heard their cry, and he raised up a deliverer for them, Moses. So as Moses goes, and just fast forwarding through the story, of course, he tells Pharaoh, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh was not inclined to go along with that. So he had to be persuaded. And he was persuaded to let them go with a series of plagues: water to blood, frogs, lice, flies, merino cattle, boils, hail, darkness, the first 9. None of those got the job done. Well, at times Pharaoh would think maybe, but then he would change his mind. And finally, we come to one last plague. This is in chapter 11 of Exodus. And this would be different and much worse than all the plagues before it. Verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "Yet one plague more I will bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will drive you away completely." This is and he describes in verse 5, Moses relating this to the people. "Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out in the midst of Egypt. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who's behind the handmill, all born of the cattle. There shall be a great cry in all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been nor ever will be again." So this is going to be the one last horrible plague that comes upon the Egyptians for, I would say, punishment for what they had done to God's people, and also to convince them to let the people go. Now, as with many of the plagues, not all of them, sometimes with the Egyptians, but sometimes, many times, they were from the plague. So the things that afflicted the Egyptians did not afflict the Israelites. And in this case, God intended to spare the Israelites from this death of the firstborn, as we see in verse 7. "But not a dog shall growl against any of the people of Israel, either man." This plague is going to come. All the firstborn are going to die. And so even if you just think about that, of course, not any kind of illness or any kind of disease could just strike the firstborn children. So this is a miraculous event. It's all going to happen in a night. Only God could do something like this, but that God had the ability to identify all those firstborn, that obviously shows that he could just choose to not afflict the Israelite firstborn. He could just say, I'm going to kill all the Egyptian firstborn, but not the Israelite firstborn. That would be all there would be to it. He had the ability to do that just by his own selection. But in his design, he chose to let the people of Israel have a part in this. Even though he could have just done it by decision, he says, I'm going to let you have a role in not being afflicted by this plague. And of course, that role had to do with the Passover lamb. So we come to chapter 12. And there's instructions for them to follow. If they don't want to have their firstborn die, they need to follow these instructions. And he tells them on the 10th day of the month, every family was to choose a lamb for a sacrifice. And he describes this lamb in verse 5. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You shall take it from the sheep or the goats. You shall keep it to the 14th day, when the whole assembly of the congregation shall kill their lambs at twilight. So on the 10th day of the month, and by the way, he says at the beginning of this is going, as of today, this will be the first month in your calendar. Your calendar year is going to start on this month. And on the 10th day of the month, every family picks out a lamb, a year old, without blemish. On the 14th day at twilight, kill the lamb. And then he tells them, verse 7, they'll take some of the blood, put it on the 2 doorposts, and on the lintel, the crosspiece of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on fire. With unleavened bread and bitter herbs, they shall eat it. And so I think in the original context here, possibly a lot of the description of this was that it was to be done in haste. They were to eat fully clothed, with staff in their hand. Everything was to be done quickly. And it seems like maybe this unleavened bread even hints at the idea of it wasn't allowed to rise. It was all done an even more significant meaning, as we will see. Verse 11, in this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, sandals on your feet, staff in your hand. I mean, normally they would sit, and they would take off their shoes. But this is going to be for this original one anyway. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, hence the name, of course, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So they would take some blood, they would put it on the doorposts, they kill the lamb, this blood, put it on the doorpost, on the lintel, and God says this is a sign. And when I come through the land, I'll see that blood and I'll skip over those houses. It's interesting. He says it'll be a sign for you. Of course, it was a sign for their benefit, but also we know that God didn't need some kind of sign to know who was where. It wasn't like he didn't know and he didn't want to get mixed up and accidentally, afflict the wrong house. So you better mark them good because I might make a mistake. It's not the problem. It wasn't something that God needed their help with. It was simply to follow that demonstrated faith on their part. So really the blood on the doorposts and lintels was more a sign there's a person here who has faith in God. Because they follow God's directions. And that shows faith on their part. And so it's really more of a sign to indicate their heart than it was sort out who was Israelite, who was not. If we skip down to verse 28, we know that it says the people of Israel went and did so as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. At midnight, the Lord struck Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no house where someone was not dead. Then, down in verse 51, and on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out by their hosts. So this was the original Passover, but it was not just a one-time event. I mean, that was a one-time event, but also built into it was a memorial meal. Back up in verse 14, he says, this day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. As a statute forever, you shall keep it as a feast. Um, and actually, to this very day, of course, modern observant Jews continue to keep this memorial. And there was more than just a one night with the roasted. You shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day, you shall remove the leaven out of your houses. If anyone eats what's leavened from the first day to the seventh day, that person shall be from Israel. So this is the Feast of Unleavened Bread as well. So you kind of have two things. You have the original Passover meal that had to be done a certain way with the blood and all that, and the people leaving. But built into those instructions is also some instructions for how on following years to remember that event. And would eat a lamb, and they would have unleavened bread, and they had to remove the leaven from their houses and then spend a week with unleavened bread, eating unleavened bread. And this was all part of the memorial meal that was to help them remember this event. Now, I looked up, and just some interesting things about this down through the years, of course. If you're an observant Jew, if you're a Jew who, not, of course, a lot of people are Jews by culture, more or less. They're like their ethnicity, but that's not that they're necessarily trying to follow the law of Moses. That's the vast majority of people. Like if you hear about somebody who's Jewish or somebody, that doesn't necessarily mean that they try to obey the law of Moses. Those would be a subset of the modern day Jews who are observant Jews. And there are pockets of those around the world where they still try to observe the law of Moses. And they do this to this day. They have the Passover, and they go through these steps that are described here. What they have to remove all of the leavened anything. Leaven. Yep, sorry, we already read all that. Their leaven would include lots of stuff. It's not just bread. They call it hametz. It's spelled CH, but it's I believe it's pronounced hametz. That's their idea for anything that's leavened. And so they have to go through their house, and all this is defined by their traditions and interpretations as to what constitutes something that has any kind of leavening agent in it. This is just kind of FYI because I think it's interesting. So they go through the house in preparation for the Passover. It's a big deal. So if you were a Jew today and you know that time is coming up, then as you approach that time, you have to go through and find and clean out anything in your house, because it's a big deal to have anything in your dwelling place that's leavened. So you go through all your cabinets and all that, and then they have a tradition that on the night of the Passover, they have that you started with a candle, and I think more modern ones use a flashlight and a feather and a wooden spoon. And even any crumbs they find, they sweep onto the wooden spoon to toss out, and then they burn the wooden spoon to completely get rid of it. So you can see they've kind of added a little bit to these instructions. But the whole idea is they go to great pains to make sure anything leavened is removed from their dwelling places, or at least that's the idea behind it. And traditionally, they'd burn anything leavened, but they also have the option of selling it. And on this, this is for helping. Yeah. You can even go on here and sell your chametz online if you want. So you fill all this out, and they help you sell it. So it's interesting how they go about this. And there's some funny things about that, but let's get back to our lesson now. I'll spare you. So let's go to Luke 22. Somewhere between Moses and modern day Jews, we get Jesus and his Jews of his day. And they were still, this was again some 12 to 1400 years after Moses did it. Every year. I mean, every year till today, they still do this. And they were doing it in Jesus' day. And Jesus was a Jew, and he was observant, of course. He perfectly kept the law. So every year of his life, he had done this. And this was time again, at this point in time, for them to prepare the Passover. So let's see how they did it. Verse 7. Then came the day of unleavened bread. Well, we know what that is, right? This is the first day when they have to get all the leaven out, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Interestingly, by the way, if you look at the timeline of Jesus being sacrificed, and that's the 14th day of the month, and you back up to the 10th day, it would have been around the time that the triumphal entry, around that, give or take. And some people try to really overlay all that, and I'm not 100% sure. But Jesus, of course, we're going to get to this point, is the Passover lamb. And so there's some interesting correlations between what was going on, because 4 days before this, they had to select their lamb. And they had to choose the lamb that we're going to use for their sacrifice. So anyway, at this point, it's the day on which the Passover lamb was to be sacrificed in verse 7. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go prepare the Passover for us that we may eat it." And they said to him, "Where will you have us prepared?" I mean, just think of it. They just wander around. And so he's telling them, "Go prepare the Passover." And they're like, like they don't have a place to have the Passover. Well, he's got that taken care of. So he said to them, "Behold, when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house where he enters. Tell the master of the house, the teacher says to you, 'Where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large upper room furnished. Prepare it there." And they went and found it just as he told them. And they prepared the Passover. Isn't that something? So they walk into town, there's a guy carrying a water pot. He bumps into him, and he leads them to a house, and they tell him the master says, all this is already all set up. There's a room. Jesus had taken care of a lot of stuff ahead of time. He knew what was coming. And I don't know exactly how he did all that, but he had this, set in motion. So when they get there, they were to prepare the Passover in this room, which would have required having the lamb ready. The lamb had to be sacrificed and offered and then cooked over fire, and any kind of leaven had to be removed. There's preparations that need to be made so that you would be able to then sit around a table and share in this memorial meal to remember the Passover. And that's exactly what happens. We come to verse 14. When the hour came, he reclined at table, and the apostles with him. And he said to them, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Now, of course, they don't realize it, but Jesus, they don't know this now. They're eating the Passover meal with the Passover lamb. That's amazing to think about. Verse 19, and he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it. This is after supper, and gave to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." So Jesus was keeping this Passover meal in remembrance of the Passover, but notice that he takes the Passover meal and transforms it in real time. Like they are eating this to remember how God spared them from the death of the firstborn and how God delivered them. But in the process of eating that meal and remembering that great deliverance, Jesus, after the meal, takes the bread and gives it a new meaning. And he takes the cup and gives it a new meaning. And he tells them, from here on, when you eat this, remember me. So they had always eaten this meal to remember that night in Egypt when their ancestors had been rescued and they had been spared from the punishment of the death of the firstborn. That's what it had always meant. But Jesus takes this unleavened bread, which was unleavened bread because they were observing the Passover, and he doesn't take the lamb, interestingly enough. He doesn't have them eat they had lamb on the table, I'm sure, because that was part of the meal. But he doesn't use that. He uses just the unleavened bread, and he uses the cup, and he gives them a whole new significance. And he tells them that this is now going to be a new kind of memorial meal that they were going to eat. When they eat the bread and they drink the cup, they're not going to remember the lamb and the sacrifice of the lamb in Egypt. They're going to remember him and his body and his blood and his sacrifice. He is the Passover lamb, the true Passover lamb that he would have them remember. And that lamb that they ate was to be killed at twilight. And we know that the next day, within 24 hours of this, Jesus would be on the cross, of course, and would die just before sundown. Because remember, they came to break the legs and he was already dead. So in the late afternoon hours, the following day, Jesus himself, our Passover lamb, would be sacrificed. And we eat this memorial meal to remember that sacrifice. And we've done that ever since, just like the Jews did all up to that point. Starting here going forward, we have a new memorial meal that we eat to remember our Passover lamb. A couple of verses that make some of these connections. Back in John, in the very first chapter, when John the Baptist saw Jesus coming, he said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Jesus is the Lamb. Remember, they had to choose a lamb, and it had to be without blemish. Peter tells us this about Jesus, that we were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot, which is exactly what was said had to be true of the Passover lamb that was sacrificed. And the blood of the Passover lamb spared the people from the judgment of the death of the firstborn. And for us, it rescues us from God's punishment. They were rescued from Egyptians' bondage. We are set free from slavery to sin and the cruel taskmaster of sin and Satan through the offering of the Passover, our Passover lamb. So there's a lot more we can say about that. And I think as we get into the cross part, what's coming up in Luke, we'll probably slow down some and really dwell on this section of it. But for today, I want to just make 3 applications of this Passover to Lord's Supper event that night. First of all, just like in the Passover, in the case of the Passover, isn't it interesting that God had them do something? He didn't always do that. And this is totally God's prerogative. Like in some cases, and I don't remember all specifically the plagues, but there were some plagues where, like, let's say there were frogs in all the Egyptians' household, and maybe there were no frogs in the Israelite household. There were some where it did affect them. That's interesting. But there was one where it was darkness in all the land. Remember, they couldn't even see or find a way around. But where the Israelites dwelled, they could see. It wasn't dark. So God had the ability, without the people doing anything at all, to make a distinction. He could just choose to do that. But in this case, he had them do something. For the first time in all those plagues, I think, if I remember right, they had instructions to follow. So up into this, 9 plagues have gone on, but on this plague, the main one, the one that's going to really make all the difference, you need to follow these directions if you don't want to have this happen to you. And I would imagine, can you imagine how close attention everybody would be paying at that point? After 9 plagues that they had witnessed, for him to say there's one last one, and God says, you need to do these things. Imagine if you're a parent and you've got children, and you're being told that now you've just witnessed all these plagues, and now you're being told all the firstborn in the whole land, including your firstborn, will die unless you follow these directions. I bet everybody there was paying as close attention as you can pay to somebody to say, what do I need to do, right? Okay, I got to get a lamb. You got to follow this thing. You got to kill it on the 14th day. And then you got to put it on the blood. There was probably not a person who didn't follow those directions to the T, right? And what that showed on their part was faith in God by following his instructions. Now, for us, of course, God could just choose to save who he wants to save and punish who he wants to punish. I mean, God could do that without any action on our part. He could just do that if he felt like it. That's up to God. But in his wisdom, by his plan, he has the lamb, his son, offered. And then he gives us something to do if we want to be spared from the judgment that is to come. And of course, that requires faith on our part. Confessing with our mouth, what difference does that make? That's what he says he wants us to do. Repenting of our sins, being baptized. Well, why would we do that? It's no different than putting blood on this door, right? It's just a show of faith. And so we baptize, it's just a show of faith. Does God need us to be baptized in order to save somebody? No, that's just what he says he wants us to do. Just like he didn't have to have the blood there to figure out who lived where. But he gave them instructions to follow. And when we do what he said, then that's faith. That's faith on our part. And that's how we take advantage of the blood of the Lamb that has been offered for us. Secondly, interesting point that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 5 from this very comparison. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 5. In 1 Corinthians 5, Paul makes the connection between this unleavened bread and our Passover, and he applies it to sin. So in 1 Corinthians 5, you might recall, they had in the church at Corinth a member who was openly living in sin, and they weren't doing anything about it. In fact, they were kind of boastful about it for some reason. They had the wrong attitude. So Paul has to kind of give them an attitude adjustment. So in verse 6, he says, your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Well, we know that figure of speech, like this is going to affect other people, but it's more than that. Notice how he ties it to the Passover in verse 7. Cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump as you really are unleavened, for Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Then he goes on to say, let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Isn't that interesting? So Paul takes this whole Passover thing, including that week of unleavened bread, and he applies it in a spiritual way to Christians. And what he says is, just like the Jews had to purge out all the leaven so they could enjoy the Passover the way God intended, we have to purge out the leaven, get rid of the sin in our lives. And just like they now go around with a flashlight and a feather and all that stuff, they want to be very careful they get all of it out. We should have the same kind of attention to detail. We don't want there to be any sin in our lives, so we purge out any leaven. And the leaven in this case is a spiritual leaven of malice and evil. We want to get rid of any kind of sin. Therefore, we can be unleavened ourselves. And then we can enjoy the festival. So the whole Passover is a memorial meal. And he's saying now we can enjoy our Passover. And our Passover lamb is Christ. And he has been sacrificed. So he really builds on this comparison between the Passover and the week of unleavened bread and applies that in a spiritual way for Christians. So as we examine ourselves, and maybe that gives a little more meaning to this or a little extra meaning in verse 11, chapter 11, when he talks about let a man examine himself and take in a worthy manner. We examine ourselves to make sure we have the right attitude, that we're doing it for the right reasons, that we're, doing it as a body. There's a lot going on in chapter 11 that, but I think it's also appropriate to examine ourselves and purge any leaven, and to make sure that we are, if we have sin in our lives, that we repent of that and we ask for forgiveness, and we can be unleavened bread so that we can really celebrate and enjoy our Passover, our memorial meal, who is Christ. And then finally, there's an interesting statement in chapter 12. He says, when your children say to you, what do you mean by this? Why are we doing this Passover thing? What's all this about? You shall say, it's the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. For he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed their heads and worshiped. So he says, you should explain this. When your children later on don't this happened, future generations will say, why do we do this? Why do we have to throw away all the leaven stuff? And why do we have to go get a lamb and kill it? And all these? Why are we doing all this? He's tell them the story. And then they bowed their heads and worshiped. And how much more us, when we observe this meal and you have children, you want them to know, why do we do this? What's this all about? Why do we assemble on the first day? Why is it important to be in church? Why is it important? Because our Passover lamb, Jesus, said long ago, do this in remembrance of me. I think it's written on the table, right? Do this as often as you eat it in remembrance of me. He gave us a memorial to remember what God did for us. He said, tell them about how God spared our houses in Egypt. We have something bigger than that. He purchased our eternal redemption and our forgiveness from sin with the blood of his own Son. And then Jesus himself said, I'm giving you a memorial. Do this in remembrance of me. So we pass that on generation after generation. And that's why we do it. And that's really the message. I always want to end with that invitation that if we can help, please.